Thank you, Paul. I'm afraid you've set the bar a little too high. Makes me a little uncomfortable. But it's great to be with you and to be back. This is one of my first Sundays out of the front hall closet in a year and 3 months, right? We're finding our way as the pandemic slowly ebbs. Well, today we're continuing the series that Paul has been pursuing based on Diana Butler Bass's book, A People's History of Christianity. And today we start section 2, which is entitled The Cathedral, Medieval Christianity, 500 to 1450 of the Common Era. And specifically, chapter 4, Christianity as Spiritual Architecture. So this is not really a Father's Day sermon, but it's appropriate for any Lord's Day. And so it was September of 2019, and our tour bus was rolling through flat farmland towards a small town. And like many small towns in Kansas, when you look at them, your eye focuses on the tallest building. But the tallest building in this little town was not the grain elevator, like many small Kansas towns. It was a cathedral, the cathedral in Chartres, the great Gothic cathedral that was built around 1200 of the Common Era. I had been to several Gothic cathedrals before, but never to that one. But like all Gothic cathedrals, for those of you who have been to them, you know when you walk in, you are immediately lifted up. There's something about the sacred proportion in the architecture that elevates you, and you realize you're in sacred space. And the stained glass windows in Chartres are particularly wonderful with that medieval stained glass and the light that flows in. And the windows served, I know this is a hard lesson for Congregationalists, because there are no stained glass windows. It's a different theology with the clear light. But in an age in which most people could not read, the windows and the statues in the church served as education for the congregation. And in Chartres, as in many medieval cathedrals, there are 2 Bible stories that are encapsulated in one of the windows. And those 2 Bible stories, the first is from Genesis, Adam and Eve's exile from the garden, from paradise into a world of trouble and evil. And the other story is, in the window, is the Good Samaritan, which is what is listed as the traditional word this morning. It sees in this parable, really, in the windows, humanity is pictured as being between heaven, paradise, and hell on earth, and is saved then by the Christ, symbolized in this visual story by the Good Samaritan. Joseph Campbell, the great professor of comparative religion and mythology, said in his storied interviews with Bill Moyers in The Power of Myth that the cathedral, like myth, puts us in touch with the archetypology of our spiritual life, the archetype of our spiritual life. Well, Butler Bass in chapter 4 makes 2 points about the relevance of early medieval Christianity to us today. The first of those points is that in medieval spirituality, there is a sense of in-betweenness, that we stand between hell and heaven. It's also true as we look back at this time that early medieval people stood between classical antiquity, Greece and Rome, and the Renaissance and the modern world today. It's why historians have labeled the period the Middle Ages. They didn't call it that then, but we all see that now. We're caught between what was and what is yet to be. And for those of you who are history buffs or not, it's important to know what was going on in their society in those early years of the medieval period and the closing years of antiquity. There was, in fact, great upheaval. There was the collapsing of civil authority in the Western Roman Empire, beginning in the 300s. Augustine, the great North African theologian, when barbarians sacked Rome in 410, bemoaned the gang of robbers. And Pope Gregory the Great, who was active in the 6th century, the 500s, wrote as follows: "Everywhere we see mourning, from all sides we hear lamentations. Cities are destroyed, military camps are overturned, fields are laid waste. We see some led captive, some mutilated, others murdered, and she, Rome herself, who once seemed to be the mistress of the world, what has remained of her is abundantly afflicted with tremendous misfortunes." People were experiencing the end of civilization as they knew it. And Butler Bass says, we live in a similar time. We are, after all, emerging from a worldwide pandemic, still raging in many parts of the world. And there are other troubling signs. Climate change. You're reading about the heat dome over the West, unprecedented in June. I think I saw 123 degrees in Las Vegas, New Mexico. That's hot for even Vegas. And a water crisis as the West is drying up. Droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, all of that. We're seeing partisan paralysis in government. As one commentator said, was the siege on the Capitol January 6th the end of something or the beginning of something? And even in the church, an article based on the Gallup poll, March 29th of this year, says that in 2020, American adult membership in religious organizations, church, synagogue, mosque, has fallen below 50% for the first time. 47% of American adults are affiliated with a religious group. That's down over 20 points since 2000. It was about 70% in 2000. Now it's down to 47%. You see a trend? And it's correlated with age. For traditionalists, that's those of us born before 1946, 66% of us are members of religious congregations, but only 36% of millennials. Something's going on. And Butler Bass says we also share with medieval people the uneasy sense of being in the middle. The modern is fading into the past, and what will be is yet to come. She says historians call our time postmodern. With no positive sense of identity, we, like them, stumble into the cathedral seeking some meaning for our spiritual lives. And that's her second point about structured spirituality. She quotes theologian Larry Rasmussen, who asks, how do we order life together in a world with a nasty tendency to fall apart? Well, here's what happened in the early church in this time period. There were two figures, Benedict of Nursia, 480 to 550. He wrote the Benedictine Rule, organizing monastic life, and you can still find Benedictine communities. Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. There's a Benedictine monastery in Pecos, New Mexico, where that spirituality is still practiced. And Gregory the Great, whom I mentioned earlier, structured parish church life around devotional patterns and social outreach. It was much later that in the High Middle Ages, circa 1200, that the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, were built. But late antiquity, early medieval period, 400, 500, 600, is a better match, Bass says, for our time. You know, Will Durant, the historian who wrote a massive 11, 12-volume history of civilization, he talks about how the migrations and upheavals in the 300s and 400s and 500s swamped civilization and made the life of the scholar, the artist, the scientist impossible. He writes, and I quote, "Perhaps the destruction would have been worse had not the church maintained some measure of order in a crumbling civilization." Ambrose, the great 4th century administrator and a priest minister in Milan, Italy, wrote, "Amid the agitations of the world, the church remains unmoved. The waves cannot shake her. While around her everything is in a horrible chaos, she offers to all the shipwrecked a tranquil port where they will find safety." And Durant adds to Ambrose's words, saying, "And often it was so." What is the church's bedrock spiritual principle which allowed her to remain unmoved, unshaken by the waves of a collapsing civilization? Why, it's the same now as it was then, as shown in the stained glass window at Chartres and in today's reading from Luke. I'm using Bernard Brandon Scott's little book, Reimagine the World, which Paul has been dealing with in a class this summer. Bernard Brandon Scott, Emeritus Professor of New Testament at Phillips in Tulsa, and a scholar's scholar. This is his version of the parables for those of us who don't read Greek and don't want to look at all the footnotes. Well, of course, the best known of all the Jesus parables is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And Scott says all the research on the historical Jesus and trying to discover who he is, what you can count on is that the parables are as close as we can get to the teachings of Jesus. They are unique and they are consistent. They give us an image, a window into the mind of Jesus of Nazareth. So, you remember the story. This fellow was on his way from Jerusalem down to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Now, when it says went from Jerusalem down to Jericho, you have to remember that Jerusalem is in the hill country, and it's at 2,700 feet elevation. Jericho is 820 feet below sea level, down at the Dead Sea in the northern end of the Rift Valley that goes all the way south through Africa. And the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho is switchbacks and twisting and turning and was very dangerous. Robbers hid behind boulders and in crevices and would come out and attack travelers. It's why most people traveled in caravans for protection. But in this story, they're not traveling in caravans. And this fellow gets attacked. They strip him, beat him up, and leave him for half dead. Now, you recall that then a priest goes by but avoids him, and a Levite goes by, turns away. In oral storytelling, things go in a triad. So the priest turns aside, the Levite turns aside. Jesus' hearers know that the third guy is the hero. Third time's a charm. And they know who the hero will be. It'll be just like them. Because that was the common triad in storytelling at the time in Jewish tradition. There was this, we would say there was a minister and there was a rabbi, right, go into the bar. Well, in their view, it's the priest, the Levite, and a Jewish layman, just like us. That's what they're prepared for. But what do they get? A Samaritan. The enmity between Jews and Samaritans is lost in the mist of history, but it's real and was real then. The Jews saw Samaritans as half-breeds. They worshipped wrong. They worshipped on Mount Gerizim, not the temple in Jerusalem. They had the wrong scripture, a different version of the Pentateuch. So in the story of the Good Samaritan, there's something to offend all the listeners. Here, a Samaritan is the hero? The notion of saying something that offends or confuses everyone is a principle which I try to incorporate every time I preach. How am I doing this morning? This is the situation. But this Samaritan, who was traveling that way, came to where he, the poor fellow, was, and moved to pity at the sight of him. He went up to him and bandaged his wounds and took care of him. Now, if Jews hated Samaritans, remember that the Samaritans also hated the Jews. So the Samaritan is moving beyond his comfort level to do what he did. And here's the bedrock spiritual principle. It goes back to the historical Jesus And back to the Samaritan character. It's what allows the church to remain unmoved amidst the agitations of the world, unshaken by the waves. It's compassion. When she encounters someone or some group who has been stripped, beaten, and left half dead, literally or figuratively, the church, like the Good Samaritan, must be moved to pity, bandaging up their wounds and taking care of them. The bedrock spiritual principle is compassion. It was then, it is now, it always will be. Increasingly, though, today the church has lost its way because it is not proclaimed and embodied and acted out of compassion. Too often today, the church practices compassion with conditions. You got to be of the right stock, which is to say race. You got to be of the right belief. Practice the right kind of worship. Engage in the right politics. Love the right people. Increasingly, folks, and especially younger folks, see the church's hypocrisy and turn away. Imagine if the church, like the Good Samaritan, practiced compassion without conditions. If in the midst of chaos, she offered to all the shipwrecked a tranquil port where they can find safety. That's the cornerstone spiritual principle which anchors all spiritual architecture. So where does that leave us? We are both the victim, left half dead, and the Good Samaritan, in need of compassion, and yet also called upon to offer compassion. Wounded by the pandemic, and also needing to reach out. What can you do to be compassionate in the web of your relationships today? What can this church do to be more compassionate in this neighborhood and the world? Not possible to offer detailed plans for the spiritual architecture of a cathedral. Not now at this time in our postmodern world. As with the in-betweenness of the Middle Ages, it's too soon for us to be clear. But this we can know and do. Amid the agitations of the world, the spiritual principle of the Christian church remains unmoved and unchanged. The waves cannot shake it. In the midst of confusion and disorder, compassion offers to all the waylaid and the shipwrecked. That is to say, all of us. A tranquil port where we will find safety and can offer compassion to others. This is the good news in every age. And all the people said, Amen.